He's Steve Topple.
And he's George Galloway.
And we are Topple Galloway. And you've joined us on patreon.com/George Galloway. Tell all your friends. Because this is going to be a weekly show, and it costs you, well, hardly anything at all. Certainly by comparison with the value, because this is razor sharp repartee. He's achingly cool, and I'm splendidly wise. He's the young, thrusting radical, and I'm the kind of social conservative. But on some things we do agree, Steve.
We do indeed.
One of those is that Theresa May's days are surely numbered.
Surely numbered, yes. I think this torturous reign that she's currently living under is being slowly brought to an end, if all matters considered are to be taken into account.
Good
Yes.
Queen Theresa's reign will have been very short and inglorious.
Inglorious, I think, best sums it up. Yes, she's presided over absolute omni-shambles of a cabinet, it has to be said, lurching from one self-induced crisis to another. And now, just to finish the Tories off, we have Michael Gove and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Ruth Davidson allegedly in the frame.
Yeah, we'll come to them, but let's stay with her for a minute. I mean, she's well named. Robot, mayhem. I mean, her name lends itself perfectly to the crisis that she's in. The only way it could have been better is if May had been out before June. But the way things are looking, May very well will be out before July, because short is her name, short was her reign. Could it have been any different? If she'd been dealt different cards, or has she just not got the right stuff in your view?
Look, I mean, I have to, as an impartial journalist, I have to be honest. I mean, Theresa May inherited this mess, essentially.
Cameron just ran away and left
bailed out. When we watched him, do you remember, in Downing Street, toddling off after he resigned, whistling to himself, a cheery little tune. She inherited this mess, to be fair to her. However, her levels of incompetence are staggering, and her inability to clean the mess up, if you like, as I think was the nail in the
Gormless, hapless. You run out of adjectives to
I'm sure we could think of a few more.
maybe we'll think of a few more in the course of this broadcast, but she will, I think, be defined by having had a perfectly respectable working parliamentary majority and throwing it all away. And she threw it all away because, as George W. Bush would put it, she underestimated Jeremy Corbyn. She thought an early election, I can wipe Labour out, I can get 100+ Tory majority, and then this Brexit thing will be easy. But it didn't work out that way.
No, absolutely. And there was also certain real arrogance about her then, and I find it with her generally. She's very dogmatic. She will do what she wants to do, even, as you say, the election. Linton Crosby, of all people, it came out after the election, advised her not to call an election.
Oh, did he? I never knew that.
Yep,
that's news.
In internal polling done by Linton Crosby for the Tory party, he first off said, do not have an election, because Corbyn's success in his meteoric rise is posing a real danger to you. And she chose to ignore Linton Crosby, of all people, and called it anyway. So I think there's this arrogance that run through everything she does, and, as I say, dogmatism. And she is not for moving.
She made this decision in her lederhosen on a Bavarian walking holiday.
There's a sight for sore eyes.
It's a Kenny Everett sketch to be had there. She whacked her hapless husband, Mr. May, and decided that this was the moment to go. And it turned out to be, well, a catastrophe. They started that general election campaign 19 points ahead and ended up losing their majority. when history comes to be written, that will be seen as one of the biggest political blunders of all time.
I think it will be, yes. I think she has secured her place in the history books, if you like, but not for the reasons she would hope for. I mean, if you look briefly at that election result, I mean, Labour wiped the floor with the Tories in the 18 to 24, the 25s to 35s, the 35s to 49. It was only in the older age groups where the Tories managed to scrabble onto their majority. And I think she's going to go down very badly in history. But I think that whoever succeeds her in this race isn't going to have much luck either.
No, well, let's come to them, runners and riders. Let's start with the most absurd.
Really?
Jacob Rees-Mogg is the member of Parliament for the 19th century. As I speculated, I stress speculation because I have never been in his bedroom. This is a man who wears double-breasted pajamas. He wears a smoking jacket and a smoking hat.
And he takes his monocle to bed, doesn't he?
He has a monocle, a nanny. Even his children have got monocles. And his nanny is their nanny. This is a man who lives in what you'd call a chateau if you weren't a Little Englander and wanted to call it a castle. It's bigger than it's more than a castle. It is a chateau. Is he, as the bookies tell us? Bookies is a quaint English word for bookmaker, man who makes bets, who opens a bookie. For the American audience, the bookies say that this MP for the 19th century is the racing certainty to be the next Tory leader. Please God, but can that be true?
Would they really make that move? I mean, surely there's some sense within the Conservative ranks somewhere which would say to them,
they chose Theresa May.
Well, they did. I'd always like to know what dirt Theresa May has on people, because there must be a reason why she stayed in Home Secretary for so many years and then got the leadership. But Rees-Mogg, surely they wouldn't, would they? Would they put forward Rees-Mogg?
I think it would be the perfect dichotomy. An authentic Labour man, Jeremy Corbyn, versus an authentic, albeit 19th century, Conservative.
I think that's a very good point, actually, because what we're seeing in Michael Gove and Ruth Davidson is this kind of Cameron brand, kind of socially liberal. They're not socially liberal at all, obviously, as we well know, but it's this kind of nice, cuddling huskies, fighting for the environment, this kind of liberal brand of conservatism. And you may be right that maybe the powers that be in the Tory party now want to shift away from that and go for something far more traditional and far more in keeping with Conservatives as we should know.
For those who are not familiar with her, Ruth Davidson is a pregnant, lesbian, former soldier, leader of the Conservative Party in Scotland. That's pretty liberal.
You don't get much more liberal.
Frankly not. In Scotland, the Scotland in which I grew up, the idea of a woman Conservative leader was kind of cutting edge. Annabel Goldie, now I think Lady Annabel Goldie, was their leader, and she was a woman, but a woman of the Margaret Thatcher type that Tories can live with traditionally. But Ruth Davidson, former soldier, pregnant, lesbian, married to her female partner, being the leader of the Conservative Party in Scotland, and actually quite a popular one.
She is, yeah.
I mean, she's got talent, she's got leadership qualities, she's got a bit of humour. And she's running, isn't she, as the kind of, I don't know what you would say, cycling partner of Michael Gove, yes, who is reinventing himself as a liberal greenie type.
It is hilarious to watch, isn't it? I mean, yes, I think the two of them together is a very interesting mix, and as you say, Gove is very much this sort of eco-warrior kind of...
going to war on plastic straws.
Yes. And how much of that you believe, I don't really know. But I think Do the Tories want to continue in that vein, or have we had enough of sort of Cameronism and big society Tory?
It is a lodge back to Cameronism.
Yeah, very much so. And I think the public maybe are not fooled by that anymore either, because underneath this socially liberal persona, you've still got they're not. David Cameron was never a Tory in the traditional sense. We lost the traditional sense of conservative years ago, and this kind of faux liberal facade that Cameron and his cronies put out, where in fact they're extremely right-wing, not even conservatives, I'd say. I think the party may think that's died to death, that niche.
Well, that's where Rees-Mogg comes in, because he'll be standing as the traditional squire. He's much more than a squire, the traditional viscount.
Yes, that's very good.
And they'll be standing as the lesbian and the eco-warrior. But we forgot Boris. He's still there. But is he too badly damaged, do you think, now, to get through that first ballot and thus into the vote amongst the Conservative Party members?
Look, with the Tory party these days, anything is possible. I think if there was one sane mind amongst them, which I very much doubt there is, surely someone would say don't touch Boris for any stretch of the imagination, because as you say, he's too damaged. They keep coming out. He can't stop himself. I mean, the latest fiasco with him being spoofed by two Russian comedians on the phone for about 18 minutes. It's mad.
How does that happen? What has Britain come to? In the old days, that would have had to go through a permanent secretary in Whitehall, who would have taken the precaution of saying, "Can I have your number and I'll call you back?"
Exactly. It quite begs belief, really. And while it's laughable, it is a damning indictment, if you like, of the system surrounding government.
I mean, what he said was damaging enough in the comic call, but it could be much more damaging.
No,
he could have imparted real state secrets to two clowns
from Russia
on a radio station in Moscow. He spoke to them for 18 minutes. But that's not his only fiasco, is it? In fact, he leapt into print to lament the murder of a Russian journalist, to hammer, by implication, Putin and the Russian government as having carried out this dastardly murder, except that too was a hoax.
That's absolutely delicious. Coming from someone who's accused of fake news all the time, that was wonderful. Just how the BBC and the Guardian latched onto it and then ran with this nonsense. I know. But it shows as well, it's fascinating, that it shows the problem we have with our mainstream media, because they get their sources generally from 3 news agencies, and they'll run with anything they're told, even when it is nonsense.
The last point on this then, because although it's endlessly fascinating, there are other big issues in the world. In a race between Michael Gove / Ruth Davidson, Boris Johnson, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, just for the record, in your view, who wins?
Gove and Davidson, just because I think the Tories will be too scared of the risk of running someone like Rees-Mogg and the possibility of losing an election.
I'm going for his lordship, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Your work on the Canary steers away from the obvious, the big politics, international affairs, wars and so on. Concentrates on a different kind of war, the disability wars. And it's gained you a massive audience. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's been quite phenomenal actually, and it makes me very happy that people come to the Canary now as a trusted source of disability politics and disabled people's rights in this country. It's something I'm passionate about. I believe very strongly in, just because it kind of encapsulates for me the way a government treats disabled people. You should therefore judge that on how it treats everyone and how it views how our society should be. And quite frankly, the past 8 years of Conservative-led rule have been absolutely appalling for disabled people in this country. We've had the United Nations saying that there's been grave and systematic violations of disabled people's human rights by successive Conservative governments. One UN representative called it a human catastrophe for disabled people in this country. So yeah, it's something I'm really passionate about. It makes me extremely angry. But it's also something that I think we need to talk about a lot more and raise people's awareness of a lot more. So,
there's been a big victory, hasn't there, in the courts?
there has, yeah. So the long and the short of it is that two claimants took the Department for Work and Pensions to a tribunal as they believed they were unfairly denied their benefits. The tribunal agreed, saying that the government had to pay them these benefits. Now, Tory government, and Theresa May's government being Theresa May's government, they arrogantly went to appeal against these judges' decisions because they believed these two people shouldn't get the benefits. However, last week they decided they were going to back down and they are no longer following that appeal. Point being is, by doing so, they have also admitted that they got the legislation surrounding these two people's benefits completely wrong. They had to admit that they've been interpreted. This is the staggering part, George, actually. The Department for Work and Pensions has had to admit that it was interpreting its own regulations wrong. It was saying that people should not have benefits when they should be having benefits. So consequently, they're now having to review the benefits of 1.6 million disabled people in this country because of a mistake on their part again. It's not the first time it's happened, though. This happened in December last year, exactly the same circumstance, where the government was ruled by judges that it had interpreted its own regulations incorrectly, and it's having to review the same 1.6 million people for those benefits. So it's just, one's minded whether it's staggering incompetence or whether it's something a bit deeper, and whether, as you say, there is actually a war on disabled people and the welfare state in this country. And I think it's the latter.
And this is not a small number of people, you know, it's not a rarefied group of specialist stamp collectors. This is millions of people,
yes,
who are caught up in this disability war.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to look at the reasons behind it. In my opinion, it's a fairly straightforward reason. Essentially, you have these capitalist, or what I'd call corporatist governments, where everyone is only valued by their financial worth, and the destruction of the welfare state is part of that. I think that if people who previously were considered disabled and could not work are now being forced into work, and it's all about productivity and about capital and about increasing the workforce in this country and reducing the welfare state. And in the process, the government is discriminating, abusing, neglecting disabled people up and down the country. And we're going to be viewed in the history books this decade as one of the most nefarious decades for how a government has treated disabled people in history. I think history is not going to judge this decade well at all.
Britain's been kicking people out of their wheelchairs, kicking away their crutches, turning them out of their sick beds, longer than 8 years. It was the Blair and Brown governments that invented ATOS and all these other instruments of torture of disabled people.
That's a very good point. It was. I mean, a lot of the reforms came in 2007 and 2008, and as we saw,
just at the time of the crash.
Well, there's a lot of theorising on that, and several academics say that the changes to the welfare state under Blair and Brown post-crash were a response to the crash, as in they needed to get more people into work to stave off the worst effects of the recession, if you like. So, and I think something to be said for that. But yes, you're correct. It did start under Blair and Brown. In the same way, for example, with PFI, private finance initiatives in hospitals and our education system. They were a conservative idea, but it was, of course, Blair and Brown that really went gung-ho with the private finance initiatives and cemented them within society. So,
two cheeks of the same backside.
Two cheeks of the same backside.
The point you're making, the overarching philosophical point that you're making, I entirely agree with, that for our system, people are profit centres. And if there are people who, by reason of age or disability, whether they ever articulate it this way or not, for these people that run our country, such individuals are now supernumerary. They are now no longer have a purpose. That's one of the reasons why I have had a lifelong opposition to euthanasia, for example, because I know that if capitalism could cleanse the chronically sick wards, cleanse the old people's homes and housing, get rid of all those who will never again turn a profit. If they could, They would, in the same way that my old father, God rest him, used to say that if the Tories could charge you for the air that you're breathing, they would do so.
Absolutely, and I'm completely with you on the euthanasia argument as well. I know a lot of disabled people's organisations are for it, and while I think there's something to be said for pro-choice, I think if circumstances were different, maybe. But these capitalist governments cannot be trusted to not abuse the chance to euthanize certain segments of the population. And it's a no-go area for me. We cannot allow that to happen, because you're right. If you're not productive to capital, you're surplus to requirements, essentially. And it's what we're seeing.
Surplus to requirements.
Surplus to requirements.
Human beings.
So, the Great Return March along the Israel-Gaza border has been going on since the 30th of March this year. During this time, there have been 112 people murdered by Israeli forces, and let's make that clear, this is murdered. Their lives haven't been taken, they haven't been killed, they've been murdered, and 13,000 people have been injured. However, the murder of one young lady, a 21-year-old nurse, has shot to the headlines in the past few days. George, I know you've been talking and tweeting and discussing this a lot. Tell us about this 21-year-old.
Well, literally millions of people, I'm getting on now for 3 million people in 4 days, have interacted with my work on this case. Her name is Razan al-Najjar. She was a 21-year-old mother wearing a white nurse's coat, holding her hands up uncomfortably like she's about to be crucified, as indeed she then was. She was shot in the back through a telescopic sniper's rifle by an American Israeli woman soldier who targeted her, got her in her sights, and murdered her in cold blood as she was going about her job as a medic. Now, this is a war crime. To take your opening remarks further, there are murders and there are war crimes. It is a specific war crime to target and kill medical personnel in a war zone who are exclusively involved in medical work.
And let's just be clear, she was easily recognisable, wasn't she?
Full white nurse's coat and with her hands up. You know, they used to say in the Westerns, put your hands up or I'll kill you. In Israel, it's put your hands up and I'll kill you. Now, you and I both traverse the mainstream media, social media, alternative media sectors. We work when we can on mainstream media, radio, television, and when we must, of course, we do so in alternative media, as we're doing right now. This was, for at least the first 48 hours, maybe a bit more, the perfect dichotomy. It was a story completely ignored in the mainstream media and by the political class, which it is by and large to this moment. And it was massive in the alternative media sector. As I say, millions, even on my own Twitter and Facebook page, were reacting, sharing, commenting, reading the stuff that I was putting out on Razan, whilst it was a total non-story to those reliant on the BBC. Now, I directly messaged Jeremy Bowen, the once respected BBC Middle East editor, saying, why is this woman not on your news? He waited, as he had to, 3 days to reply and said haughtily, it was covered in full last night, i.e. Sunday night, but she was murdered on Friday. What kind of murder of a medical nurse in this carnage that you talk about? 13,000 wounded. I mean, you don't get 13,000 wounded in wars. The scale of the carnage is enormous.
Let's just touch on that, sorry, because you talk about the delay, if you like, there was in the mainstream media picking up on this story. That seems for me, for someone who's been watching the geopolitical situation in the Middle East for many years now, it seems to be an ongoing trait, doesn't it? That there seems to be a blanket shutdown of broadcasting of certain stories relating to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And we saw it especially during the 2014 attack on Gaza. I won't call it a war or a conflict. It was a relentless attack by the Israeli Defense Forces on Gaza. Why do you think there is this shutdown almost?
Well, it's self-censorship for the most part. And that self-censorship, which, as Francis Bacon said, is the arrow that flies in the night. You can't see it, but you know that it's happening, is partly understandable and partly utterly deplorable. It's understandable because as soon as you touch the letters spelling Israel on your keyboard, you know that after this comes the deluge, that there's an entire industry out there which is dedicated day and night to descend with ferocity, career-ending ferocity, on anyone who challenges the pro-Israel narrative. So most journalists shrug and say, well, to be honest, I could do without that. And you can understand, especially in the broadcast media, it's not worth the candle for them to tell the truth. But the end result of that is the dehumanization of the Palestinian victims. Let me put it the way I did in a celebrated encounter with Sky News in 2006. The truth is, the blood of some people is much more valuable than the blood of others. And the blood of Palestinian, Muslim refugees is amongst the cheapest blood in the world.
I think it's a very apt way to sum it up, and the blood of this tragic, poor 21-year-old nurse is also extremely cheap in the eyes of many people.
Steve, Britain's railways must be unique in the world, that other state railways from other countries own large parts of the British rail industry, which was formerly owned by the British state, but now highly subsidised, owned by private operators. And it ain't going well, is it?
It's not. It's the wonders of Tory nationalisation. Every other country can own our rail network apart from us.
You couldn't make that up.
You couldn't. It's ridiculous, isn't it? The trains in this country, it's a catastrophe that's been building for years. We've seen, obviously, the selling off of the railway since 1994, I believe it was when John Major finally got rid of them all. And since then, it's just lurched from one crisis to another. We've seen the notorious Southern Rail be fined £13 million by the government. We've seen North West trains performing badly. We've seen the East Coast Main Line, once well into public hands, performing well, train operating line. That's now back into public hands after the privatisation of
Well, they walked away. Richard Branson walked away from a contract with the British state to run that railway, with a guaranteed return to the government of billions of pounds. They've just thrown up their hands and said, we can't actually make this profit, so we're out of here, leaving the taxpayer to pick up the disadvantage.
Correct, yes. And what that East Coast franchise sums up is what I call zombie privatisation. It's where you have these rotting cadavers of corporations wandering aimlessly through our public services with their brains disengaged, but they're clamouring and clawing for the blood of public money. And zombie privatisation sums it up. It's just a mindless privatisation with mindless companies running our infrastructure, and ultimately it's almost self-defeating for a government which prides itself on capitalism, because the whole notion of capitalism is that you have the infrastructure in place to productively gets the workers to and from their employment. The UK's rail infrastructure is failing to get workers to and from employment, so it's self-defeating if you think of it from a capitalist viewpoint.
No, you're too young to know it at its best, but you did know it at its worst. British Rail, when it was publicly owned, had been systematically starved of public investment, even though the government owned it. and it ought to have been an emblem of the country, an icon of the country. And therefore people hated it. And so they were suckers for the argument that let Richard Branson and other privateers run it. It'll be much better. The sandwiches will taste better. And what's happened is we're now subsidizing the privateers 3 times as much as we subsidized our own British Rail. And so we've got a situation where in my lifetime, people loved, then hated the state-run railway, then loved, and now hate the privatised railway. Where's this going to end? Labour are going to bring it back into public ownership, but only if we're out of the European Union, because the European Union insists that you must allow private companies to tender for railway services.
Absolutely, it's competition laws, isn't it? We've seen it in the NHS as well. It's what allows Richard Branson again. Richard Branson.
Yeah, he's everywhere. He's even in space. I wish he was in space. Yes, Mars wouldn't be far enough.
It's these laws which allow Richard Branson to sue our NHS because there wasn't a fair and open competition to one of the contracts. And where will this train chaos end? You know what? I don't actually know under the Tories. We had Chris Graham in Parliament on Monday apologising for the state of the rail network, saying there's going to be an inquiry into it. But
another inquiry
into an inquiry. Yes, and I don't know where this is.
It's hit the buffers.
It's run out of track.
It's run out of track. And is there any other cliche we can recover?
Sure.
But it's hit the buffers because things like Southern Rail, known universally as Southern Fail, which serves really busy commuter lines to the south of London, into London, has not just become standing room only. It's not just become a railway that cannot be depended upon. It may be the most hated private company in the land.
It's staggering, isn't it? And again, it encapsulates the issue we have with privatisation in this country. You have a corporate monolith that's only interested in its bottom line and its profit margins, and it's driven by greed, running what should be proud and important public services. And the way Southern behaves encapsulates the whole industry. Private greed ahead of public interest, and that sums it up for me.
It does, but it's also a situation like the banks where profits are privatised, but costs and liabilities, and ultimately these companies are too big to fail, so the taxpayer has to rescue them. So the costs are socialised, the profits are privatised. I mean, even the high priests of capitalism would have to say there's something wrong with that model.
They would have something to say, but then if you look at that model in its most extreme, the whole 2008 financial crisis was essentially a crisis of capitalism and a crisis of private institutions, and it's wound up being a crisis for the public purse, ultimately.
Yeah, and we're going to have to come back to that subject, because he's been Steve Topple.
And he's been George Galloway.
And this has been the very first edition of Topple Galloway. Now, if you're watching this, you already know. But if you're only hearing about this, here's how you watch us every week. Razor sharp repartee. Topple Galloway can only be accessed for less than 20 pence per show on patreon.com/George Galloway. It's been marvellous. See you next week. No. Just one more thing from me. The murder of the 21-year-old Palestinian nurse Razan al-Najjar that we spoke about in Topple Galloway is a crime that must not be allowed to stand, is a death that must not be forgotten. Out, damned spot! All the perfumes of Arabia will not expunge the stain of Razan's blood from the hands of those who murdered her. But just as guilty are those, to continue the biblical metaphor, who pass by on the other side of the road. Unless these criminals are held accountable, then our political class, our international institutions and our mass media will have failed even their own miserable standards.
Just one more thing from me as well. What if I told you that our government had been accused by the United Nations of committing grave and systematic violations of people's human rights? What if I told you there'd been 5 reports in 24 months into the human rights violations of a group of people in this country? What if I also told you that one UN representative said that it was a human catastrophe for these people, and that the government had created a society where they were viewed as parasites, living off the state and living off the benefits of others? You'd be shocked, right? Yes? So what if I told you this group of people was disabled people? Do you feel any differently? Because I somehow think you do. Because the past 8 years in this country have seen systematic attacks on disabled people from our Conservative-led government. It's been going on right under our noses, and yet there's still not much of a public outcry. We all need to get behind and be a voice and stick up for disabled people in the UK, and quickly.